Build a legacy bank. How do you build and leave a legacy? In this episode, I'm going to share with you a story I don't tell very many people about how my father made me turn myself into the cops. So my name's Doug Andrew, and I've helped many people not only capture some of the stories and the I remember when memories, but leave those things behind to their posterity or to the world. And I've actually helped many create books, and some have become bestsellers. So in the various training that I do, I share with people how to capture the knowledge, the attitudes, the skills, and the habits that made you who you are. The beginning letter of each of those words, knowledge would be K, attitudes is A, S is skills, starts with the S, and then habits is the H. So that spells the acronym KASH, KASH. See, I think it's more important that we leave behind the knowledge, attitudes, skills, and habits that made you who you were than a bunch of CASH to your kids and grandkids. So one of the popular concepts that I teach in my various books is how to capture that cash, the stories that are in here or in here in your heart, and leave them behind to those that you care about, who made you who you were, because if you don't, they'll go to your grave with you. So I'm going to share one story, and I remember when memory that my kids and my grandkids love Grandpa to tell. You're going to see why so many people, even the troubled youth that my wife and I mentor at the crisis centers and in the detention centers, love to hear this story, because they'll see me walk in dressed like this, and they'll go, "Oh yeah, you've never been in trouble with the police, I'm sure." Well, no, not true. Let's go back to when I was 15 years old and 9 months. Now, back when I was growing up in Orem, Utah, jobs were scarce. I had worked at a ski company, grinding the bindings, the ears and so forth on the ski bindings. I had picked fruit and cherry orchards. But the dream job was to work at Kentucky Fried Chicken. Do you know that KFC actually started in the state of Utah with Pete Harmon at the Dewdrop Inn? The KFC was opening a new franchise in my hometown of Orem, and they paid back then $1.25 an hour, whereas McDonald's, which was a fairly new franchise, they only paid 95 cents an hour. So I wanted the prestige, but see, this KFC was only hiring 3 chicken cooks, and you had to be 16 years old and have a food handler's permit, and I wasn't quite 16 yet. But I convinced the county health department to let me take the course and get my food handler's permit, and so I lined up on a Saturday morning to be interviewed for this position. Well, guess what? This interview was done in Provo at the only KFC in that county, and the line was clear down the street. There were over 150 boys lined up to be interviewed for 3 chicken cook positions. Jobs were scarce. And as I was standing in line, you know, there were 17 and 18 and 19-year-olds, and I was 15 years and 9 months. I was thinking, I don't have a chance. But I went ahead and stayed there, and I had prepared this resume. Frankly, I was a little bit embarrassed about this resume because it said I had only, picked cherries and so forth. What experience did I have? I went through the interview, and the following Monday I was called, and I was given the job. I was blown away, and the owner said, "You know why I hired you? You're the only boy out of over 150 that left a resume. And on that resume, it said you were an Eagle Scout." And that was true, and he said, "So I hired you." So I was very grateful. Well, I worked very hard the first year, and I worked my way up to assistant night manager at the KFC. I was just a sophomore in high school, and I was managing other chicken cooks that were seniors, 2 years older than me, but they respected me, and I appreciated that. But I wanted to be cool. I wanted to be in. And so these chicken cooks said, "Hey, Guess what? There's a new overpass that's just been constructed in Provo going to Brigham Young University. Now, see, Interstate 15 hadn't been constructed yet, and so an overpass usually was only when railroad tracks went over. You had to go to California to the freeways to have an overpass. And so they said, let's close up real fast at the end of the night and let's go down and huck some eggs off the overpass, see if we can hit some cars. And I knew better, but I gave in to the pressure. I said, okay. So we cleaned up really fast and we took down a flat of eggs, 30 eggs, and we got our kicks throwing these eggs off the overpass, and we saw brake lights come on. As far as I knew, we didn't hit any cars. I felt really stupid, but I gave in and did that with that peer pressure. Well, I got home that night, and no later than I sometimes got home, but my mom and dad, they had intuition like you couldn't believe. She knew if my brother Sherm or me, Doug, were up to no good. And instead of waiting in bed, they were in the living room in those two rust-colored chairs. And I opened the door, and they said, son, where have you been? Now, I had learned earlier in my childhood that if I lied, I got into deeper yogurt. And I felt about this high when I blurted out, I've been down throwing eggs at cars off the new overpass. I had done some stupid things before, and my dad, he had only really spanked me, hit me hard once, and that was when I didn't come home for several hours, and they were very worried, and he apologized profusely for that. He didn't come up and hit me and whack me. He came up and he put his arm around me and said, son, we thought we could trust you. That was like a dagger. Yeah, I had bankrupted the trust bank in one night. And he said, let's take a ride. I said, where to? He said, we're going to go up to the Orem City Police Department. I said, Dad, you're turning me in to the cops? He says, no, you're going to turn yourself in. That was the longest ride. You see, about a month earlier, I had closed up KFC the night before the 4th of July, the biggest day for people to buy chicken for picnics. We were burglarized, and I got a call the next morning. I wasn't due to work till that night, and it was Sergeant Francis Fillmore of the Orem City Police Department. Everybody in high school knew Sergeant Francis Fillmore. And he said, well, the store got burglarized last night. Now, the owner said, Doug, that you're the most impeccably honest, responsible young man he's ever met. So we know you had nothing to do with this, but routinely we have to ask questions on how you closed up, but it looks like it was an inside job. And actually it was, because somebody had poured grease all over the floor in the dark and hauled out a 300-pound safe in a cement block. And 9 months later, they found that safe in the Provo River. It had been blown open with some dynamite or something. But see, they hadn't solved the case 30 days later. So he assured me, no, we don't suspect you at all. Just come up, answer these questions, and then I worked that night. Well, I knew what he had said, and so I was hoping Sergeant Francis Fillmore wasn't working graveyard at Orem City Police Department at 11 o'clock that night. Sergeant Francis Fillmore. He said, what brings you here this hour of the night, Doug, Andrew? And I said, well, sir, I have a confession to make. So he took me in, sat me down. I can still see the green lamp and the fingerprint cards. He got out the recorder, read me my Miranda rights, and said, proceed. And I proceeded to confess the egg-tossing caper. And he sighed relief. I said, you're relieved? He said, I thought you were confessing to the burglary. I said, no, I wouldn't do something that stupid. He was relieved, but I'll never forget my dad said, would you explain to my son what could have happened? And he said, well, we didn't have any reports of accidents, but I heard words like involuntary manslaughter. And I knew that was a defining moment in my life. And I rode home that night thanking my father for loving me enough to turn myself into the cops. I'll never forget that story. I did other stupid things in my life, but I remember that incident that when I knew better, that I had bankrupted the trust bank in one night, and it took me several months to rebuild that trust again because I had betrayed those freedoms, the trust that my parents had in me. Now, when I share that story, see, that's what people love to hear, because if I went to my grave without sharing that, how many of my posterity would feel like, wow, I never heard that story, or I wanted to hear it firsthand from the guy it happened to. So this is an example of an I remember when story. When we go on family vacations, we have our children and grandchildren all come for the week vacation, whether it's in Maui or a camp out, with 3 I remember when stories. I want it to be 1 page and they can cut it up into episodes. I've done this with my siblings, but this is a way to capture the knowledge, attitude, skills, and habits through stories and I remember when experiences. If this is resonating with you, I would recommend you watch this episode and then get a free copy of my book, Entitlement Abolition, where I talk about how to do this, how to capture I remember whens. There's 1 whole chapter on it. I'd love to fire out a copy to you. You just pay a nominal $5.95 shipping and handling by going to entitlementabolitionbook.com.